everyone. Hi, everyone. Bible month this year, 2021, focuses on the Gospel of Mark. Added to that, this year lectionary reading is on Mark's Gospel. The purpose of this video is to give an idea of how a biblical text could be read from different perspectives. There is no one single way of reading the text. We all are different and conditioned by our own culture, social location, and our personal and community background. Most of us, those who live in 21st century, realize that no one reads the Bible unbiased. Our experiences and the world around us shape how we read the Bible. For example, I begin to enter the biblical text from my own background as a migrant woman of Indian origin and a Dalit theologian, and I see the text through that particular lens. That defines my perspective. So, our own context, social location, our personal experiences, and the situation we live in influences the way we read the text. So, the purpose of this video is to give you a few samples of those different approaches in reading the biblical text, which you wouldn't hear otherwise. Only few approaches are presented here, as there are so many other perspectives across the world based on each one's experiences, culture, and context. Hearing different approaches will enrich our understanding of the text better and also will enable us to seek for the relevance of the text for our context today. Let us hear those perspectives. The first text we will be reflecting on is Mark chapter 1, verses 40 to 45. When I read this passage, I could see 2 points that I wanted to pick up for my reflection as a Dalit woman theologian. One is the aspect of social distancing, and the other is the aspect of purity and pollution. The leper in this story and in the biblical time was forced to live under the restrictions of the law until the priest certified him as cleansed. He could not return to a normal life in his family, but forced to live outside the camp as per the Jewish law in Leviticus chapter 13, verses 45 and 46. Social alienation and the issue of purity is coupled together to marginalize a person and deny equality with the rest of the community. It is a similar situation to Dalit community in India. Social distancing has been forced by a high caste community to keep the Dalits away from the main village or town. Today, in the context of COVID, social distancing is a hygienic practice of keeping safe, the physical distance to avoid the transmission of communicable diseases. But in the context of Indian caste-based society, untouchability is a practice that alienates a group of people and denying them social equality. Mark chapter 1, verses 40 to 45 describes a situation in which Jesus was challenged by the leper. When the leper said, "If you choose, you can make me clean." Was Jesus forced to take that action with the challenging question posed by leper? The implication would be, if Jesus touches him, he will join the polluted community or he will join the outcast group. If Jesus wasn't choosing to touch him, then it would mean that Jesus also accepting the traditional practice of purity and pollution, which kept a group of people at the margins. In a way, he joins with the powerful and the high caste. But in this incident, Jesus decides to transcend the margins set by the law of purity and pollution. Though born of a Jewish family and learned the laws and regulations, he decided to touch the untouchable. By touching untouchable, he became an untouchable himself. Though Jesus want him not to say anything to people, but he spread the news. You could imagine how he might have felt when he got the freedom to join his family and the community that he belonged. The restrictions are removed. On the other hand, Jesus was not able to go into the public places, but stayed as an outcast outside of the town for a while. It is a good news for the marginalized or Dalit community. Jesus became an untouchable, an outcast, in order to bring the untouchable and outcast into main community. Social distancing removed, purity and pollution dismantled. Jesus became a Dalit in order for a Dalit to get his or her rights. To bring an outsider to become an insider, Jesus chose to become an outsider. Take a time to reflect. Have you ever challenged by a person whom you consider as an outsider, which led you to take some action?
Hello, I'm David Holgate, Residentiary Canon at Manchester Cathedral, where I work with theology and mission. Here's my reflection on Mark 1:40 to 45. Do remember always to read the passage before studying it. It sounds obvious, but many people avoid that crucial step. I want to use the tools of textual criticism and social scientific criticism to shed light on the passage. If you look at your Bible, you will see that there are two textual variants mentioned here. One in verse 40, where the words kneeling and kneeling are added. We don't need to pause on that one. But later in verse 42, there's a variant where Jesus is said to be not filled with compassion for the leper, but angry. And we think, what? How can that be? How can some manuscripts say that Jesus was angry when the leper asked him to be cleansed? And I use a wonderful reference book called the Textual Commentary on the Greek New Testament by Bruce Metzger to study these things, and they can be really helpful. As a textual critic, Bruce Metzger says that it's likely that the word is compassion and not anger, simply because the main, most reliable manuscripts use compassion, not anger. He also says if we look at other passages in Mark where Jesus is described as being angry, there are no manuscripts which change that to compassion. But it is possible that this variation arose because in verse 43, where Jesus gives the cleansed man a stern warning, that somebody might have thought, well, that meant he was angry rather than compassionate. There's also the intriguing possibility that in Aramaic, the words for pity and rage are very similar. But I think we can be fairly sure that Jesus responded with compassion. But where did he feel this? The Greek word for compassion here, filled with compassion, is splanchnistes. And this literally means Jesus felt compassion in his guts, in his bowels. I love that word, and it's a reminder to me that the world in which Jesus ministered was different from ours. And social scientific criticism can alert us to matters which are culturally significant. Here, the leper is cleansed, not healed, because he was regarded by the people of his time as being polluted by having an ugly skin condition, which somehow broke barriers between his outside and his inside. And Jesus' response is probably not to heal him, but to say, you actually are included in the people of God. You are not an outsider. And so it is an act of inclusion rather than healing. And he's sent back to the temple authorities to say, the rabbi said, I am clean. I wonder sometimes whether we in the modern church still behave in a way which places some people in the category of pollutants. Very, very sadly, I've heard of situations where same-sex couples have been regarded as somewhat unwelcome influences in their community and so excluded. But it is social scientific criticism that helps us to see this.
Good morning. How may the text of Mark chapter 1, verses 40 through 45 on Jesus' healing of the leper be read through a Bosadi approach? The Bosadi, that is womanhood redefined approach, seeks to reread biblical texts through the lens of these women's unique experiences. They sit at the bottom of South Africa's socio-economic ladder. They have inherited the legacy of the intersectional oppressions of racism, classism, and sexism, both in the broader South African culture and in the African cultures. Who are these? They are South African women. Is it any wonder that poverty, not only in this women's context, but also in the rest of the continent, continues to carry a feminine face? Poverty has bedfellows such as hunger, persevering through abusive marriages, ill mental health, and disease, among others. It occasions no surprise, therefore, that even in the wake of the global COVID-19 pandemic, these women would be the hardest hit in terms of holistic health. Yet, these are the women who mostly fill our pews on Sundays, who cling to the God proclaimed in the Christian Bible. For better, for worse, in their lives, Jesus occupies a central position as Savior, healer, and deliverer from all sorts of bondages. The women will thus not find it hard to identify with the leper in Mark 1, 40 through 45. Why so? The leper was the outcast of his time, the neglected, the untouchable. Like poor, vulnerable South African women, lepers were disenfranchised. Although without physical health, the leper's faith was good enough to touch the heart of Jehoshua, this one whose main mission was that of Redeemer in Matthew 1:21, Luke 4:18 through 19. This one who associates with the poor both in spirit and materially, Luke 4:18, Matthew 5:3, the outcast. For Jesus has come to seek and to save the lost, the untouchables, the infectious, because Jesus was and still is the healer of all diseases. Through faith in Jesus and in the absence of the luxury of a medical scheme, through complete trust in Jesus' healing power and refusing to succumb to the majority view of rejection and ostracization and shame, like the leper in Mark, these women cling to Jesus and believe in Jesus for deliverance from all sorts of bondages. Like the leper, upon deliverance, the women are not ashamed to share their testimonies with those who may be encountering similar challenges, be they diseased, gender-based violence, poverty, and joblessness, among others. Those who would have heard their testimony of deliverance can thus, like those who heard the testimony of the woman of Samaria, boldly acclaim, quote unquote, "It is no longer because of what you said that we believe, for we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this is truly the Savior of the world," in John 4:43. Thank you.
Reading Mark chapter 1, verses 40 to 41 today, and employing a subversive reading of the text, or a method of reading the text from below, I gather two important themes in this text. Firstly, this text of a person who had leprosy being healed by Jesus Christ is a text of inclusion. In those days, in the first century Palestine, when a person had this skin disease or leprosy, they were excluded. And when living in exclusion, Jesus, when this person who had leprosy, when approached Jesus, he was challenging Jesus by saying, "If you choose, you can make me clean." And by asking such a question, he has put it in the court of Jesus Christ by choice. If you have come to this world to heal, you are called towards inclusion. So if you choose, and by your choice, you can make me included into the society, because having had this skin disease, I have been excluded by law, by tradition, by society, and by community. So Jesus, by healing this person, built a community of inclusion, and therefore he healed this person and he went on to share about it. The second theme I see from this text is about liberation. And when Jesus healed this person who has been excluded, and you can also notice that because this person is facing exclusion by virtue of his skin disease, his name is forgotten, unknown, or even not recorded by the gospel writer. And when he was healed, Jesus immediately said to him that he needs to go and show to the priest according to the Mosaic law to say that he has been healed, and sternly warned not to share about this healing. But if you read verse 45, this person who was healed and who had this sense of inclusion, but he went out and began to proclaim it freely, to spread the word, so that Jesus could no longer get into this place. So in a way, in that sense of liberation, this person who has been healed, he trespasses. I'm not sure whether he went to the temple, to the priest, and according to the Mosaic law, to get a confirmation from the priest. There is no mention in the record. But however, when in that freedom, when he had found that sense of belonging, that he belongs in this community, he went on freely, celebrated that freedom, and no tradition, no law, or no boundary could stop him. But all the while, what he did was to share how he had been liberated and how he had been included. So on applying this method for our context today, we live in a world where exclusion is reality. People living on the margins, and there has been so much divide in terms of class, caste, race, gender, and this text is an invitation for us to strive for inclusion and to see to it people celebrate freedom, people celebrate liberation, and no boundary of tradition, law, or religion can contain a person when he is included and when he feels or she feels that sense of belonging in that community. This text is about inclusion, is about celebrating freedom, and is about sharing that freedom that we have in Jesus Christ.
I'm looking at Mark chapter 1, verses 40 to 45, and I'm trying to do so from a decolonizing perspective, not necessarily post-colonial, because that implies that we've moved beyond any kind of colonial mindset, but decolonizing, attempting to move beyond. I do so very consciously from a very privileged white Western background, one of, if you like, the colonizers rather than the colonized. And I think what a decolonizing approach attempts to do is to name that, to name the perspective that you come from, and to look beyond the surface reading of the text to see where our reading is distorted by centuries of a particular perspective being dominant and therefore assumed to be right or orthodox or more appropriate in some way, but also recognizing that the narratives we get will often privilege certain people in some way. You're more likely to be named if you're male, for example. Certain cultural backgrounds. And then it's read through a very imperial lens. It's read through the lens of those who have spent centuries building empires around the world. It's read from the perspective of power. So with that in mind, I read this passage, and the first thing I notice is a leper. That is, his whole identity in terms of this passage is about his condition. He's a man who has leprosy, but because that is all consuming in terms of your place in society, in terms of how you engage with the community of which you are in theory a part, we have here a man who is in effect disabled. That is, he is disabled by his community. His community does not enable him to be a part of it because of fear of transmission of the illness. There might be some resonance for our times in that. And then kneels to him and offers him the choice. If you choose, you can make me clean. And I'm very aware of the power that he places into the hands of Jesus. He's right, Jesus does have that power. But there's a real power imbalance there. I notice that those who are disabled by their community, those who are marginalised, those who are told you don't meet the norm, you don't meet society's standards, whether that be because of your cultural background, because of your physical or mental disability, whether it be because of your linguistic background, your ethnicity, your sexual orientation, your gender identity. We presume a degree of normality that's usually based around white male heterosexual, Western, middle class, educated. And that places power automatically into the hands of those who have, and not those who have not. But I also notice Jesus' compassion, moved with pity, the English says, or moved with anger. I just notice and leave that there. Pity and anger, we tend to think of as two very different things. And so I find myself reading it from my privileged lens, wondering what in that situation Jesus is angry about. And then he says, I do choose. Be made clean.
Hi, I'm Murugesan Raja. I'm a general practitioner in the UK, and I also kind of specialise in various other things, including training and chest medicine. Thank you, Jasmine, for asking me to reflect on how difficult COVID has been, and reflecting on Mark 1 and reflecting on all of the stories where Jesus has healed lepers. It is quite striking if you look at the Old Testament on how things were with people who had leprosy, and how the priest had to go out of the camp to actually see them. And this is quite powerful in this text, that the leper is asking for Jesus if he's willing, and that's that submission, which is really very interesting. But when I talk about COVID and how it has affected people, especially how it affected the marginalised people, I work in an area of deprivation even within the UK, where people have to work to have a living and have to work to get their money in to be able to make sure they can put food on the table for themselves and for the children. And something like COVID would actually make them not be able to go work, and of course they were avoiding tests as well because of the difficulty that they would cause, and most of them would suffer because they actually became very poorly. India has been very distressing lately to me on many fronts, including personal fronts, and the difficulty that you see with patients not having access to basic care, oxygen, medications, being treated on the floor, and the worst is not even have the dignity of death or the funeral arrangements after. and the more deprived you are, or the more poverty of resources you have, the more difficulty it gives you. And it's the same with even people who are able to afford, because there isn't any access to available healthcare. And COVID has kind of leveled everything, and the marginalized people, unfortunately, are more disproportionately affected. There's a lot of learning for all of us in this, in how Jesus tries to reach out to all of us. COVID is probably a time to reflect and learn about how vulnerable we are, even though the virus is something that's not even visible, but it shows how it can affect us, and how we're always dependent on God, and how as a prayer we just plead and submit that He is fully in control, and that is what reassures us that God is still in control in spite of all these situations. So I just wanted to reflect on this and share my personal experience, which have been quite difficult, and from a patient perspective on how they've been through during this difficult time of COVID. Thank you very much for listening.